Act 2, Scene 1.
So we made it through Act 1, 7 scenes, and it's kind of interesting how Shakespeare sets up the act structure. I think it's based on the Greek model, which is there's 5 episodes in between, like the beginning of the play, the prologue, and then the entrance of the chorus, and then the exodus at the end where the chorus exits. I believe that's the reason why Shakespeare wrote in a 5-act structure. What do you think?
I think the first act's usually the exposition, second act, rising action, to a degree, and then third act. I wouldn't say the climax because I feel like in a lot of plays the climax does happen in the 5th act, but probably the point of no return would be the 3rd act.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because major climactic moments happen in Act 3 in Shakespeare's plays. And, I won't say that the rest of the play is like a just denouement or resolution, but like even like in Hamlet, like it definitely comes to a high point when he's about ready to kill the king and he's all alone and he could do it easily and he decides against it. Like that's like a major climactic moment.
Yeah, it seems like the theme gets revealed in the 3rd act.
It's a big turning point in the story, in a way. But so here we are in the 2nd act, and it's nighttime. It's really late.
Yeah, and Shakespeare will do this a lot. He'll use the weather to reflect whatever is going on in the world at the time. And in the case of Macbeth, at this moment in the play, it's a pitch black night to the point where Banquo and his son Fleance, who are Fleance or Fleance?
I say Fleance. But
yeah, sounds about right. They're out and about and they can't see the moon right now, so they're lost in the ambiguity of the moment. What would you say that portends? All of this weather.
I think it's definitely not a scene that you can take for granted. And if you're doing a full production of Macbeth, you have to have a little boy. Mm-hmm. And it's possible that he could be real little. He could be, 5 years old maybe. He has to be able to say lines and all that, but he could also be a teenager. He could be almost maybe coming into manhood. And it's a very significant scene in that, when the prophecy is made in 1.3 by the witches to Macbeth, there's also a prophecy that's made about Banquo. And talks about Banquo's, issues becoming king. Thou shalt get king, so thou be none. And here is not just mention of it again, but we are actually visualizing it. We're, as an audience, we're getting a chance to see that he has offspring.
And in the first moment we see, or the second moment, pretty close to the beginning, Banquo's getting skittish about noises and what might be out there. And so he starts handing Banquo first a sword and then something else that the text doesn't necessarily specify. He says, take this too. So that might be his tunic, his dagger, a sidearm, something else. And I think we're getting this image when Banquo's handing his belongings and these tools of war down to his son, that there's this stage picture, I think, that Shakespeare's writing in, which is this young man being armed with all of the furnishments of Banquo, his father.
And one of the big points is that he talks about being really tired, and he would want to sleep, yet something's on his mind. And we find out when Macbeth enters what kind of is on Banquo's mind. But you're right when you talk about the weather and how it reflects things, because he says that there's husbandry in heaven, which means that the heavens are being cheap. They're not, their lights are not on. They're saving the energy. And so, it does establish that spoken decor of it being pitch dark. No moon, no stars.
And it cooperates with some of the metaphors we've heard before through Lady Macbeth and Macbeth, with this idea of stars hiding their fire, Lady Macbeth praying that heaven gets veiled so that they can't cry hold. And here we have Banquo, a separate character altogether, saying that heaven is being cheap, leaving the light off, all that stuff. So Shakespeare's setting the wheels in motion. And it's funny because he has a soliloquy of sorts, or an aside, where he is a lot more ambiguous than Macbeth as far as what he's saying in this. It seems like his imagination is going to certain avenues because of the prophecy, but he's not being as on the nose about murder or these foul deeds in the same way Macbeth is. Now, do you think that's simply because Banquo is not the title character, or do you think that there's something specific about Banquo as an individual in this play that's making him decide not to go there yet?
Yeah, I just don't think he's put it all together. I don't think at this moment he suspects Macbeth at all of treason and being capable of killing the king. Mm-hmm. I mean, I feel that would really hurt just the development of the play if it would be kind of unnecessary foreshadowing. It would be kind of tipping the hat way too early. And things wouldn't be allowed to evolve,
Yeah, I didn't mean necessarily that he'd be telegraphing that he already knows what Macbeth is up to. I just mean that, do you think that he has any seeds planted of misdeeds that he might be willing to do to make sure his sons are king? Or do you think that he's where Macbeth is when he's saying...
Yeah, I don't think that is the case because, I think we should talk about what happens next because... all of a sudden Macbeth appears out of nowhere. They're like, who's there?
And he's nervous.
And Macbeth identifies himself as a friend. And then he says, the king's asleep, but before he went to sleep, he greets your wife with this diamond. Now, it's possible that he refers to the wife as being a diamond because she's such a great hostess. But I think in most editions of the play, for some reason, Banquo has been given a diamond from Duncan to give to Macbeth to give to his wife. As a gift, a thank you for hosting us. Here are some of my jewels, and then Macbeth says, thanks for the compliment of how well we hosted, but if I was a little more prepared, we would have done even better. Mm-hmm. And then Banquo brings up that he dreamt of the weird sisters last night. So
it wasn't all in one day. The unities of time just make it feel like it's all in one day.
Yeah, so this goes back to the Aristotle ideal of what a great drama is, and all tragedies written during the classical Greek period, that kind of 100-year, 5th century BC period, or to be politically correct, what do they call it, BCE, before Common Era. Mm. That they had this, unities of time, place, and action, that every story seemed to take place from the rising of the sun to the setting of the sun. And the only time changes, the chorus in between shows a change in time, like maybe a little fast forward of time. And there's definitely evidence of that in a lot of, Sophocles' plays. Like, for instance, in... what's the one about the daughter?
Antigone?
Yeah, Antigone. So sorry. Antigone, yeah, there's some things that have to occur in between the scenes for certain things to happen. And so you kind of go along with this idea that there's, a little bit of a fast forward. But other than that, it plays out in real time. The story develops in real time. And this Shakespeare was roundly criticized, especially by the neoclassicists. The French in the 17th century really thought he was a bad playwright because he was so horrible about unities of time, place, and action. That Hamlet, one of the greatest jokes of the whole play, Hamlet, is that the first act occurs, and then in 2.1, it's 2 full months later. Mm-hmm. And the audience is not really informed of that until a little bit later into the scene. So it's a little confusing, but it's also kind of a joke. It's kind of maybe Shakespeare's way of just saying, see what I did there? You think this one scene goes right into the next scene when in essence it's 2 months later.
It's so funny though, because unless you're really working on it and you're just leaning back as an audience, you don't really recognize these little details. And I almost feel like you could argue that it still does feel like the span of one day. I mean, it's the second act and we're already seeing Dead Night, but it seems to still flow. I feel like Hamlet still flows, but I see where the criticism would be.
And so Banquo brings up, hey, so I dreamt of the weird sisters, and it's hard to think that a day has passed and they had a night to sleep on it, and that might just be a mistake on Shakespeare's part. He's just not maybe paying attention, and that's maybe where the neoclassicists are like, wow, he needs to be a little more detail oriented. But basically, Macbeth says, if you shall cleave to my consent when 'tis, because Banquo says, I dreamt of the weird sisters. He goes, Macbeth says to him, it shall make great honor for you. And then Banquo says, as long as it doesn't challenge my allegiance right now to the king, to King Duncan. And then Macbeth's like, oh, okay, good repose, have a good night's sleep. And I think he has to take notice that Fleance is there. I think that's an important point for Macbeth, especially for later in the play.
Well, also, how convinced do you think Banquo can be that Macbeth isn't thinking of them? He saw him zone out. He saw the way he was acting right after. And I feel like a good director would take advantage of this scene to have this lens of almost noir energy with this, where it's dark, they're in the shadows, trying to feel out the other person. They already did that, we were saying, with your children shall be kings, you shall be king. And there's this nervous laughter of, are we friends or are we foes? The first thing Macbeth says is he is a friend. Is that ironic?
Yeah, I think that's important.
And so when Banquo hears that he's not thinking of them, there is a line break too, right? Where Macbeth then reloads with, but we could talk about it later if you want. So
yeah, so I mean, and maybe that's if you want to talk about fatal flaw now. Okay, so if Banquo, if anything happens to Banquo, are there seeds of a fatal flaw for him? I know he's not the protagonist, but should he maybe be a little more aware? Should he be a little more skeptical of Macbeth? And at this point, yeah, you don't want to give away the story, so you can't create this big backstory for Banquo. Otherwise, it might ruin some of the plot that happens. Like he can't be looking at Macbeth really suspiciously now, like, what you got in mind there, huh? Okay, yeah. So don't lose my allegiance. I don't think it's really examined. I think it's just more like, yeah, okay, I hear, yeah, it's, that one thing about you becoming Thane of Cawdor came true. So yeah, if it does happen, I'll hear you out.
I mean, I don't think that they're holding each other in contempt necessarily, but I feel like there's got to be a red flag or two that goes off when Macbeth says he's not thinking of the witches. And okay, why is he out right now in the middle of the night?
If it is a red flag, it's one that he notes inside his brain.
Oh, of course. I don't think he's wagging his finger at Macbeth for sure. No, I'm not saying that.
You can't. What's that word?
Telegraph.
Yeah, you can't telegraph.
No, I don't think so. That's why I feel like there's this noir quality to this where, okay, maybe that I'm abusing the phrase, but you know what I mean. Like,
okay, so Banquo and his son Fleance go to sleep. Macbeth is kind of standing there, and there's a servant there, and he says, when my drink is ready, which is probably wassail, and we'll talk about that in a second, have her strike upon the bell to tell me that my drink is ready. And what I know about wassail or mulled wine, it takes oftentimes several hours to make. Over the holidays, wassail or mulled wine has like herbs and spices in it, and you have to slowly cook it, and it's a really warm alcoholic drink that probably helps put you to sleep. So that's the ruse that Macbeth is using for, to tell the servant, hey, I'm in place, go tell Lady Macbeth that, now that I'm in place, this is code, I'm saying, have my drink ready and then ring upon the bell.
Yeah, he's waiting for the starter gun to go off so he could get to business.
And which might help with an alibi too, when you think about it, right?
Like I was getting my drink at the time.
Yeah, so if the messenger is asked, if the servant is asked, well, what did you notice? Oh, well, yeah, I got Mr. Macbeth. I got the Thane notification of his drink being ready, and so he went up and he had his mulled wine. So maybe it's another way to set up so anyway, he's standing there in the dark, and then all of a sudden he says, "Is this a dagger which I see before me?" the handle toward my hand. And it's such a great, like one of the greatest soliloquies of all time. Macbeth is seeing a dagger suspended in air right in front of him. Okay? And I don't need to go through it because, but there are there's like 3 or 4 real particular beats about it. And then he says, he notices that the handle's toward his hand, and he says, "Come, let me clutch thee." And then he says, "I have thee not." So he reaches for it, and yet he's not able to grasp it. So what's going on there?
Well, one thing that I was reading our buddy Harold Bloom talk about is, and it is interesting, is you see a dagger floating in front of your face, and your first instinct is to grab it. What do you make of that? I mean, if you saw a dagger floating in front of your face, would you want to get away from it?
I think it's because Macbeth is a man of action. Mm-hmm. If he was a bit more like Hamlet, maybe it wouldn't be a tragedy. He's probably more like Fortinbras. He acts upon things. He sees a dagger. He's used to being in war. Oh, it's a challenge to me. A dagger. Was it going to come hit me? Let me reach for it to stop it. It's whatever. Oh, I reach for thee and I don't have thee in my hand. And then what reason does he give for it being in front of him at first?
He can't tell if he's hallucinating the dagger or not.
Yeah. And why would he be hallucinating a dagger?
Well, he's trying to make that up. He can't tell whether, he says later, if his eyes are failing him or if his eyes are more profound than the rest of his senses and are seeing something that's truthful.
I mean, he says, well, is this just, or am I just too overly wrought? Am I too, emotional? Like I'm really scared because I'm about ready to kill the king. Is that why I'm seeing this dagger? Mm-hmm. Could there be other reasons? Could it be the witches? Could the witches be making sure that he goes through with the plot by creating a dagger, which then now he says, I see thee yet in form as palpable as this, which now I draw. Mm-hmm. So he's talking about palpable, which is meaning something to be touched, something to be handled, and yet he's not able to handle this thing. Mm-hmm. And then he says, there is no such thing, but then he says, I see thee still, and on thy blade and dudgeon gouts of blood, which was not so before. So the things that happen is there's a dagger that comes in front of him. He reaches for it. It's not there. He can't, it's kind of like invisible. It's visible, but it's not palpable. Mm-hmm. And that he compares it to the dagger that he has with him on his side, I assume.
Mm-hmm. Starts bleeding.
And then it starts to move in the direction of, where he's going to walk to go kill Duncan. And then, he says, I see thee still, and it's getting worse. There's blood on the dagger now. Mm-hmm. And so if this is only in his mind, he's seeing the outcome of what it's going to be like to kill somebody with a dagger like that. So he says that there's no such thing, and that it's the bloody business that informs his eyes thus. But then the next thing he says is, now o'er the one-half world nature seems dead. So I wonder, what happens in between? Does the dagger go away? Or does it continue to lead him and trance-like he's following the dagger and he goes off? And I've been in different productions. I directed a production where I actually had the 3 witches holding the dagger and him not seeing that the 3 witches are there, but handing it off one to the other. Mm-hmm. And that they took the dagger and they led it up the stairs and he followed it. So the dagger never went away. It was there the whole time.
Yeah, and that's the tricky thing about the witches is Banquo sees the witches with Macbeth. So it seems like there might be a distinction. I feel like there's a distinction between what Macbeth experiences and the presence of the witch. Because if Banquo can see it, then that means that it's not just unique to Macbeth, but this dagger seems like something that only he's really experiencing. And later he has more experiences that seem only akin to him.
And I would even say, if as a director I have witches holding the dagger, that still doesn't mean that they're there. You know? It's just kind of maybe a reminder to the audience that like, maybe it's not. Maybe it's that they're having it both ways. They're getting him to murder, but at the same time, they're messing with his mind. Which, what is better for demonic people, than to not only get them to do your bidding to kill others, but also have, a sense of, not being secure in what you're doing, and to have doubts and to question yourself. I'm sure they would love that,
Yeah.
And then he talks about how now it feels like nature seems dead, and that wicked dreams are abusing the people that are sleeping right now, and that pale Hecate's offerings are leading people to withered murder, which is alarum by the sentinel, the wolf whose house is watched, which I think is a reference to Lady Macbeth. Do you get that?
The Tarquin steps?
No, not Tarquin, but when talks about the wolf whose house is watch, thus with his stealthy alarm by the sentinel, the wolf.
No, but what makes you say that it's a reference to her?
Well, because he's referring to, the murder is kind of being personified, and it's being alarmed by someone. So a bell is being
I see
rang,
what you mean.
because you hear that later, right? I mean, at the tail end of the speech, you hear the bell being rung, right? And then he says that he's going with Tarquin's ravishing strides. Do you know that reference?
Yes. So in the Rape of Lucrece, the poem that Shakespeare wrote, it's based off of legendary rape, and Tarquin is the rapist in this situation.
Yeah. So I guess an ancient Roman by the name of Tarquin was obsessed with Lucrece, and he visited her in the middle of the night and had his way with her, and then it caused a civil war. So he's referencing how quiet he has to be when he takes every step. And I think that's a really great action for the actor playing, is that, you're kind of hushing the ground, because, I don't know, maybe once he hits those steps, they're made out of wood and they creak, or, he has shoes on that clack when they hit the stone. But he definitely talks about them being made out of stone. And then he says, whilst I threat he lives, words to the heat of deeds, too cold breath gives. And who's the he that he's referring to?
Oh, Duncan.
Yeah, words to the heat of deeds, too cold breath gives. I go and it is done. And he hears the bell, right? The bell invites me. Hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell. And I find that part incredibly interesting. And I when I was directed when I played Macbeth, I was directed to create a pause in between to give it some kind of suspense. So, hear it not, Duncan, for it is a knell that summons thee to heaven or to hell.
The power of antithesis.
And I just wonder, why does Macbeth even say that? Why would he question whether or not Duncan's soul would go to heaven or hell? Wouldn't he think, well, his soul's going to heaven?
That is a good point, because he's talking about how great of a guy he was before. Why wouldn't he go to heaven? Yeah.
You know what I think it is? I think it's the spirituality that's based in Christianity, the belief that you really don't know the inside thoughts of any person and what their actions are. And I think it harkens back to a play of Shakespeare's that was written probably 5 or 6 years ago, earlier, Hamlet. Like
when the father ends up in purgatory.
Yeah, the father's in purgatory. Who would expect that? He's a hero. But he talks about some of the sins that were on his soul that he wasn't able to have. He talk about shrift, going to confession. It was unannealed. These sins of his were unannealed. He did not ask a priest for forgiveness for these particular sins, so he had that on his soul. And it's interesting he would take the time to say that, you might not go to heaven after I kill you.
Or like Othello telling Desdemona to pray before he kills her. This idea of washing yourself clean so you have a fighting chance to get to heaven.
But I wonder, what if, and of course this is just a stretch and it doesn't really have much meaning, But what if something happened at the banquet that made Macbeth question? You know,
He's getting handsy with a
oh yeah,
bar
maybe he's having relations with some chambermaid, or he's overly drinking, or he's doing something out of the ordinary for Duncan.
Yeah, maybe
That's
he's
a trigger.
He's not the saint that we thought he was.
So anyway, you have to have a really great actor playing Macbeth to pull off a monologue like that. That was my absolute favorite moment of soliloquies to do, was this soliloquy, because for me it was just so active, trying to find the dagger flying in the air, trying to kind of pinpoint where in the air it is, and so that you're consistent with that when you reach for it, you know, the first and second time, and when you're asking it to go away. It's just such an active soliloquy in that regard. So.
I've never done it, but it seems like if you could get as specific as you can with the image of where the dagger's going, that's going to be most of the work here, and the words are going to follow that.